The airlock wouldn't seal and Marcus could hear the hissing getting louder, which meant he had maybe 90 seconds before the entire section depressurized, and if that happened everyone in C-Deck would die, including his daughter who was sleeping 3 corridors away, and he didn't even know why the ship had started doing this or what had triggered the emergency in the first place, because 20 minutes ago everything was fine and now the walls were vibrating with a frequency that made his teeth ache, and the lights kept flickering between normal white and something else, something that looked almost purple. And when he finally got the manual override to engage and the door slammed shut, he stood there in the corridor trying to catch his breath, and that's when he saw the handprint on the wall, except it wasn't a handprint, it had 7 fingers, and the skin that left it had ridges like nothing he'd ever seen. And Marcus had been working salvage on deep space wrecks for 11 years, so he'd seen a lot of things, but never anything close to this, and he pulled out his comm to radio the bridge, but all he got was static, and underneath the static something that might have been breathing or might have been the sound of the ship's hull contracting, but it was rhythmic and deliberate, and it made his stomach turn, and he started moving toward his daughter's quarters, because whatever was happening he needed to get to her first and worry about protocol later. And as he moved through the corridors he noticed that some of the doors were open doors that should have been locked, doors that required biometric clearance, and inside those rooms he could see that things had been moved, not destroyed, just moved, like someone had been searching for something specific. And the crew photos on the walls were all facing backward, and he didn't want to think about what that meant or who would have had time to do that, because the ship had only gone dark 8 minutes ago according to his watch. But maybe his watch was wrong, maybe time was doing something strange here. And when he finally reached his daughter's door, it was sealed, and he pressed his palm to the scanner and nothing happened. And he tried his override code and still nothing, and he could hear her voice inside calling for him, and he started pounding on the door and yelling her name, and then the door opened, but not from his side, it opened from the inside, and his daughter Emma was standing there, and she looked fine, she looked completely normal, except her eyes were different, not the color but the way she was looking at him, like she was studying him, like she'd never seen him before. And she said, "Dad, the ship wants to show us something," and Marcus felt his blood go cold, because Emma was 8 years old and she didn't talk like that, she didn't use words like that, and he said, "Show us what, baby?" And she just smiled and took his hand, and her hand was too cold, way too cold, and she led him down the corridor toward the observation deck, and he should have stopped her, he should have grabbed her and run the other way, but something in him needed to know, needed to see what she was talking about. And when they got to the observation deck, the shutters were open, which was impossible because the shutters were always closed during sleep cycles to save power, and outside in the black he could see it. And at first he thought it was a planet, but planets don't move like that, don't pulse with light from the inside, and as he watched he realized it was a ship, but calling it a ship was like calling an ocean a puddle, because this thing was massive, so massive that their entire vessel could have fit inside it 1,000 times, and it wasn't made of metal or anything. He recognized it looked organic, like it had been grown instead of built, and there were lights moving beneath its surface, billions of them, flowing in patterns that hurt to look at, because his brain kept trying to find meaning in them, kept trying to see shapes and symbols, and every time he almost understood something the pattern would shift and he'd lose it. And Emma was still holding his hand, and she said, "It's been waiting for us for a long time, Dad, it knew we'd come this way." And Marcus said, "How do you know that?" And Emma looked up at him with those strange eyes and said, "Because it told me, it's been telling all of us, but most people don't listen, their minds are too loud, but children hear it better." And Marcus wanted to ask what she meant by all of us, but then he heard footsteps behind him, and he turned and saw Captain Rivera, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days, even though he'd seen her just a few hours ago at dinner. And she said, "You see it too?" And Marcus nodded, and Rivera said, "It appeared 6 hours ago, we've been drifting toward it ever since. I tried to fire the engines, but nothing works, everything's locked, and the crew, they're all acting strange. Half of them are in the cargo bay just standing there staring at the walls, and the other half are in their quarters and they won't come out. And I think something came aboard, Marcus. I think when we passed through that debris field yesterday, something got inside the ship." And Marcus remembered the debris field they'd passed through. It hadn't looked like much, just scattered fragments of what the sensors said was an old probe, but now he wasn't sure. Now he thought maybe those fragments weren't from a probe at all, and he said, "We need to get everyone to the escape pods." And Rivera laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it was the sound of someone who'd already given up. And she said, "I tried that, the pods won't launch, the ship won't let them." And Marcus said, "What do you mean the ship won't let them?" And Rivera said, "I mean the ship is alive, Marcus, or something's making it alive, I don't know which, but it's not ours anymore." And Emma squeezed his hand and said, "It wants to take us somewhere special, somewhere we're needed." And Rivera looked at Emma and her face went white, and she said, "How long has she been talking like that?" And Marcus didn't answer because he didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to admit that his daughter had changed, that something had gotten inside her head. And then the ship lurched and they all stumbled and the lights went completely dark, and in the darkness Marcus could hear voices not through the comm but in the air around him, dozens of voices all whispering the same thing over and over, and he couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong, too flat, too emotionless. And when the lights came back on, Emma was gone and so was Rivera, and Marcus was alone in the observation deck, and the massive ship outside was closer now, so close he could see details on its surface, could see what looked like windows or eyes, he couldn't tell which, and something was moving inside those openings, something that reflected the light in ways that made his head hurt. And he ran out of the observation deck and started searching for Emma, but every corridor looked the same now, even though he'd walked these halls 1,000 times, and he kept finding crew members but they wouldn't respond to him. They were all busy doing tasks that made no sense, rearranging equipment, writing symbols on the walls in what looked like blood, but he hoped it was just paint. And one of them looked at him and smiled and said, "We're almost there, we're almost ready." And Marcus grabbed him and said, "Ready for what?" And the crew member just kept smiling and said, "The integration, the beautiful integration." And Marcus let him go and kept running, and he found the bridge. But the door was sealed, and through the small window he could see the entire command crew sitting at their stations perfectly still, and on the main screen the massive ship was filling the entire view. And Marcus realized they were going to dock with it or it was going to swallow them, he couldn't tell which, and he finally found Emma in the cargo bay, and she was standing with 30 other crew members, all of them perfectly silent, all of them staring at the ceiling. And Marcus ran to her and picked her up, and she didn't resist but she didn't react either, and he carried her toward the escape pods, and he didn't care what Rivera said. He was going to get one of those pods working even if he had to tear it apart and rebuild it himself. And when he got to the pod bay he found that one of them was active, one of them had power, and he didn't question it, didn't wonder why. He just got Emma inside and strapped her in and started the launch sequence, and the pod doors opened and he could see space beyond, and he hit the launch button and nothing happened, and he hit it again and again, and then he heard Emma's voice behind him, but it wasn't Emma's voice anymore, it was something else using her voice, and she said, "You can't leave, Dad, we're part of it now, we've always been part of it, we just didn't remember." And Marcus turned and looked at his daughter, and she was smiling but her eyes were completely black now, no whites, no iris, just black, and she said, "It's been calling us since before we were born, since before Earth, since before anything, and now we finally get to go home, to the real home." And Marcus felt something break inside him, and he said, "What did it do to you?" And Emma tilted her head in a way that wasn't human and said, "It woke me up, it woke all of us up, and you'll understand soon, Dad, you'll understand when we arrive." And Marcus looked out the pod window and saw that they were moving into the massive ship, that the docking had begun, and the walls around them were changing, becoming something else, something that looked wet and alive. And he realized that Rivera was wrong. This wasn't about the ship being taken over, this was about the ship becoming part of something larger, something that had been waiting in the dark between stars for vessels like theirs to wander close enough. And he thought about all the salvage jobs he'd done, all the derelict ships he'd found floating empty, and he wondered if they'd all ended up like this, if they'd all been integrated and their crews taken somewhere else. And Emma reached out and touched his face, and her hand was warm now, and she said, "Don't be afraid, Dad, it doesn't hurt, and where we're going is so beautiful, so much better than the cold and the dark." And Marcus wanted to pull away, wanted to fight, wanted to do something, but he found that he couldn't move, and he could feel something spreading through him, starting in his chest and moving outward, and it felt like drowning and flying at the same time. And the last thing he saw before his vision went dark was the interior of the massive ship, and it wasn't empty, it was full of other vessels, thousands of them, maybe millions, all of them nestled together like eggs in a nest, and he could sense the people inside them, could feel their minds touching his, and they were all so calm, so peaceful. And as his consciousness began to merge with theirs, he had one final thought, one last moment of clarity, and he understood that they hadn't been taken, they'd been collected, and somewhere in the vast intelligence that was absorbing them there was a purpose, a reason, and humanity had just become part of something ancient and patient and utterly alien. And the worst part, the part that made him want to scream even as his mind dissolved into the collective, was that Emma had been right, it was beautiful, and he didn't want to fight it anymore, and that terrified him more than anything else ever had.